Hello, and welcome back to Bedtime Story. Before we begin tonight's tale, I'd love to know where you're listening from. If these stories have become part of your nightly routine, consider leaving a like and subscribing. It really helps the channel. Now get comfortable, settle in, take a deep, calming breath, and let's begin. In this new story. The worst night of Thomas Avery's 30 years of camping began with something so ordinary that he almost ignored it. A red pickup was parked beside a locked forest gate when he and two longtime friends arrived in western North Carolina during the first week of September. The truck was dusty, empty, and positioned far enough from the road that it probably belonged to another camper. Nothing about it seemed threatening. The three men continued nearly 5 miles into the mountains and established camp beside a narrow creek. By sunrise the following morning, they would understand that the pickup had been empty for a reason. Someone had already gone into those woods before them, and sometime during the night, that person came back. Thomas was 61 and had spent much of his adult life hiking throughout the southern Appalachians. His companions, Robert and Michael, were equally experienced. They preferred primitive camping and deliberately chose places where developed campgrounds, generators, and recreational vehicles were unlikely to disturb them. Their route that weekend followed an old logging road through national forest land before descending into a valley containing several small creeks. The closest occupied building was a ranger maintenance facility several miles away, and cellular service disappeared soon after they left the highway. The men reached their chosen campsite shortly before 4 in the afternoon. It was a flat clearing above the creek with enough space for 3 small tents and a cooking area. Someone had camped there previously. An old fire ring remained near the center, and several cut branches had been stacked beneath a tree. Nothing looked recent. They established camp, filtered water, and spent the remaining daylight exploring upstream. Their only unusual discovery was a length of blue nylon cord tied between 2 trees almost half a mile from camp. Robert assumed hunters had used it to mark a route and left it untouched. By 8:30, darkness had settled completely over the valley. The men ate beside a small fire before storing their food away from the tents. The evening was calm enough that they could hear water moving over stones nearly 100 yards downstream. Shortly before 10, Michael noticed a light high on the opposite slope. It appeared once between the trees, disappeared, and returned several minutes later. The men assumed another camper was moving along the ridge with a headlamp. The red pickup at the trailhead made that explanation even more likely. The light gradually descended the mountain. It never remained visible long enough for them to follow its exact route, but each appearance seemed lower than the previous one. Eventually, it vanished behind the trees near the creek. The men expected whoever carried it to appear on the logging road or establish another campsite nearby. Neither happened. After waiting another half hour, they extinguished the fire and entered their tents. The unknown camper became nothing more than another person sharing several thousand acres of forest. Thomas woke shortly after midnight because something metallic struck a rock near the creek. The sound was brief but distinct. He remained still and listened. Several minutes later came a softer noise, followed by water splashing somewhere downstream. He assumed the other camper was crossing the creek and nearly returned to sleep. Then he noticed a faint white light moving across the fabric of his tent. Someone with a flashlight was somewhere outside. The beam disappeared before Thomas could determine its direction. He waited for footsteps but heard only the creak. A few minutes later, the light returned. This time, it passed slowly across the lower portion of his tent before moving toward Robert's. Thomas sat upright and reached for his flashlight. He still believed another camper had wandered into the clearing accidentally, but something about the movement bothered him. The person carrying the light was not searching for the trail. The beam remained low and seemed to examine the ground immediately around the tents. Thomas quietly opened his tent enough to see outside. The clearing was almost completely dark. No light was visible, and nothing moved near the fire ring. Robert's tent remained closed. Michael stood several yards beyond it. Thomas watched for nearly a minute before noticing something beside the trees at the edge of camp. A pale shape was partly visible against a dark trunk. He could not determine whether it was clothing, exposed bark, or simply moonlight reaching through the canopy. Before he could focus on it, the shape disappeared behind the tree. He woke the others without raising his voice. Within moments, all three men were awake and listening. Nothing approached the tents. No flashlight returned. After several minutes, they stepped outside together and illuminated the clearing. Nobody was there. They searched only as far as their lights could reach and deliberately avoided walking into the surrounding forest. The men had no interest in confronting a stranger after midnight when they were several hours from immediate help. The campsite appeared undisturbed until Michael noticed the cooking area. A metal cup that had been left upside down beside the fire ring was missing. That probably explained the sound Thomas had heard near the creek. They searched briefly, but could not find it. Nothing else had been taken. Their food remained secured, their backpacks were untouched, and no equipment of value was missing. The theft of a single inexpensive cup made less sense than someone stealing supplies. The men returned to the tents, but decided that one person would remain awake at all times. Robert took the first watch and sat beneath a tree with his flashlight turned off. Nearly 40 minutes passed without anything unusual. Then he heard 3 slow knocks somewhere across the creek. They were evenly spaced and loud enough that Thomas and Michael heard them from inside their tents. After a pause, another 3 knocks came from farther downstream. The men knew woodpeckers and falling branches could produce repetitive sounds, but this was after 1 in the morning and the sequence appeared to be moving. Robert directed his flashlight across the creek. Nothing reflected the beam. Several minutes later, another sound came from uphill behind the campsite. It was not knocking. Someone appeared to be dragging something through leaves. The movement continued for perhaps 20 seconds and then stopped. By 2 o'clock, none of them intended to sleep. They remained together near the tents and discussed leaving. But hiking 5 miles through unfamiliar mountain terrain in darkness presented a greater immediate risk. The old logging road contained several washed-out sections and a creek crossing that was difficult even during daylight. They decided to remain until the first usable light, then pack quickly and return to their vehicles. Around 2:30, the distant headlamp appeared again. This time, it was not on the mountain, it was across the creek, perhaps 60 yards from camp. The light remained completely stationary between 2 trees. The men watched it for almost a minute. It did not sweep across the ground or move like someone walking. Then it disappeared. Less than 30 seconds later, something struck the side of Michael's tent. The impact was not powerful enough to damage the fabric, but it caused all 3 men to move immediately. Thomas illuminated the area while Robert checked the ground. A small stone lay beside the tent. It was wet despite the surrounding campsite being dry. Michael believed it had come from the creek. Nobody could have thrown it from the opposite bank with enough accuracy through the trees, meaning whoever threw it was probably somewhere on their side of the water. They stopped trying to understand the situation and concentrated on staying together. Thomas activated the emergency messaging function on his satellite communicator, but described the situation as suspicious activity rather than an immediate medical emergency. The device confirmed that the message had transmitted. They knew assistance would not arrive quickly, but at least someone outside the valley now knew their location and circumstances. For nearly an hour, nothing else happened. The silence gradually became more uncomfortable than the earlier noises. Even the creek seemed unusually loud without insects filling the background. Then Robert noticed a smell drifting through the clearing. It resembled cigarette smoke. None of the men smoked. The odor became stronger for perhaps a minute before fading. Someone was close enough for smoke to reach their campsite, yet their flashlights revealed nobody among the trees. Shortly before 4, footsteps appeared on the old logging road. They approached slowly from the direction of the trailhead. The men heard each step clearly as it crossed loose gravel. The sound continued until whoever was walking seemed to reach the edge of the clearing. Then it stopped. Thomas kept his flashlight aimed toward the road while the others remained behind him. Nothing entered the beam. Several minutes passed before the footsteps began again, but they were now moving away. The men listened as they gradually disappeared toward the creek crossing. No one followed them. The decision to leave at dawn had already been made, and the only goal now was to avoid creating a confrontation during the final hour of darkness. The sky began brightening shortly after 5:30. As soon as they could see the road without flashlights, the men packed. They left breakfast untouched and dismantled the tents in less than 20 minutes. During the process, Michael walked to the creek for one final check of the water bottles. He stopped before reaching the bank. Thomas's missing metal cup was sitting upright on a flat rock in the middle of the creek. The cup had been positioned carefully above the waterline. Reaching that rock required stepping through knee-deep water from either bank. None of the men had placed it there. More disturbing was the blue nylon cord tied around its handle. It appeared identical to the cord they had found upstream the previous afternoon. Thomas left the cup where it was. Whatever explanation existed, nobody wanted an object that had apparently been removed from their campsite and returned in such a deliberate way. The men started toward the trailhead shortly after 6. Morning light changed the forest completely, and their fear began to feel less immediate. They moved quickly, but did not run. About 2 miles from camp, Robert noticed another length of blue cord tied around a tree beside the logging road. A second appeared several hundred yards farther ahead. The men had not noticed either marker while hiking in 2 days earlier. The cord continued appearing at irregular intervals. Each piece was short and tied at roughly shoulder height. The markers seemed to follow their route toward the trailhead. Thomas began wondering whether hunters had placed them overnight, although he could not understand why someone would mark a road that was already easy to follow. The men did not touch any of them and continued walking. Less than a mile from the parking area, they found something that changed their understanding of the night. A narrow path left the logging road and disappeared uphill through rhododendron. Fresh disturbance in the leaves suggested someone had used it recently. From the main road, the path was almost invisible. Robert followed it only far enough to see where it went. Approximately 40 yards uphill stood a small hunting blind constructed from dark fabric and branches. The blind overlooked the logging road. They did not approach it. The possibility that whoever had frightened them might still be nearby was enough to keep everyone moving. When they finally reached the forest gate, both of their vehicles remained exactly where they had left them. The red pickup was also still parked nearby. In daylight, they noticed details they had missed when arriving. Pine needles covered the windshield. One tire was almost completely flat, and leaves had accumulated beneath the truck. It had not arrived recently. A ranger reached the parking area less than half an hour later after receiving their satellite message. The men described the flashlight, missing cup, thrown stone, cigarette smoke, footsteps, blue cord, and hunting blind. The ranger inspected their vehicles before accompanying another officer toward the location of the blind. The 3 campers remained near the gate. The officers returned later that morning. The blind was empty, but clearly used. Inside were several plastic water bottles, cigarette ends, food wrappers, an old sleeping bag, and a folding chair. Nothing identified whoever had occupied it. More importantly, a second narrow path continued from behind the blind into the forest. According to the officers, it eventually connected with another abandoned logging route leading toward the valley where the men had camped. Someone familiar with those paths could travel between the trailhead and their campsite without spending much time on the road. That explained how a person might approach unseen. It also explained the changing locations of the light and some of the sounds surrounding camp. The situation suddenly seemed less mysterious, but it became considerably more disturbing. They had probably not encountered something inexplicable in the mountains. They had encountered another person who knew the mountains much better than they did. The red pickup provided no immediate answer. Its registration led to a man living in another county, but the vehicle had reportedly been left near the forest weeks earlier after mechanical trouble. The owner was not believed to be staying in the area when the campers encountered it. Whether someone else had been using the truck or simply knew it would remain parked there was never established. Authorities removed the abandoned blind and increased patrols around the access road for several weeks. No arrest followed, the three friends were never contacted again, and none of their property was damaged. From an official standpoint, the incident amounted to suspicious activity by an unidentified person in a remote section of public forest. There was no evidence that the stranger intended physical harm. Thomas found that conclusion difficult to find comforting. Someone had watched their campsite closely enough to know when the fire went out. That person had approached each tent after midnight, taken an object that had no value, carried it to the creek, tied a familiar marker around it, and returned repeatedly without ever attempting to speak or steal anything useful. The purpose seemed to be making sure the campers understood that someone else was nearby. The men later reconsidered the blue cord they had found during their first afternoon. They had assumed it marked a hunting route. After seeing similar pieces along their exit path, they wondered whether the markers served another purpose. Someone might have been identifying routes between the hidden blind, the creek, and places where visitors commonly established camp. There was no evidence proving that theory, and the men eventually stopped trying to give every detail an explanation. They continued camping together in later years, but their habits changed. They became more cautious about apparently abandoned vehicles, hidden side trails, and signs that someone had been living in remote areas. They also stopped assuming that isolation meant they were alone. Wildlife could be identified, weather could be monitored, equipment failures could be prepared for. Another person observing from somewhere beyond the firelight was harder to predict. For Thomas, that September night remained frightening precisely because nothing supernatural was required to explain it. The flashlight outside his tent had probably belonged to a person. The cigarette smoke almost certainly had. The footsteps on the gravel were real enough for three experienced campers to hear them simultaneously. Somewhere beyond their clearing, an unidentified stranger may have spent hours moving through paths the men did not know existed. Years afterward, Thomas still remembered the final moment at the creek more clearly than everything else. Morning had already begun. The darkness was disappearing, and the mountains were becoming ordinary again. Yet, his metal cup stood in the middle of the flowing water with that piece of blue cord tied carefully around its handle. Whoever had placed it there could have simply taken it. Instead, they returned it where the men were certain to find it before leaving. That was why none of the three friends ever camped in that valley again. They had gone there because it was miles from the nearest house, road, or immediate help. They believed distance would give them privacy. By sunrise, they understood the mistake in that assumption. Being far from civilization did not necessarily mean nobody else was nearby. Sometimes it only meant there was nobody nearby to hear what happened after the fire went out. In this new story, when investigators review emergency calls from the Appalachian Mountains, they quickly discover that the most unusual reports rarely involve violent crimes or major disasters. Instead, many begin with ordinary people describing something that simply did not make sense. A driver refuses to leave a vehicle after seeing someone standing beside an empty road. A family abandons a campsite before sunrise without taking their belongings. A veteran hunter suddenly turns around after spending decades walking the same trails. Most of those incidents are eventually explained through weather, wildlife, or simple misunderstanding. Others remain preserved inside county files because every practical explanation failed to account for the evidence. One such investigation began during the final week of July 2019 in a remote section of eastern Tennessee, where several unrelated travelers reported the same disturbing encounter after driving through the mountains long after dark. The reports all centered on Hollow Creek Road, a narrow two-lane highway winding through dense forest less than 15 miles from the Tennessee-North Carolina border. During daylight hours, the route was popular with hikers and anglers traveling toward nearby public lands. After sunset, however, traffic dropped dramatically. The road contained long stretches without homes, businesses, or reliable cellular service. Local deputies routinely patrolled the area because stranded motorists occasionally required assistance after hitting wildlife or suffering mechanical problems. Serious criminal activity remained rare, making the sudden increase in emergency calls during one particular week immediately stand out to investigators reviewing dispatch records. The first report came from a retired couple returning home after visiting relatives. Shortly before 11 o'clock, they contacted emergency dispatch after noticing a person standing beside the road near an abandoned wooden bridge. According to their statement, the individual appeared to be wearing dark clothing and remained completely still as their vehicle approached. Concerned that someone might have been injured or attempting to flag down passing traffic, the driver slowed to offer assistance. Before the vehicle reached the bridge, however, the figure disappeared behind the guardrail without crossing the road or entering the surrounding forest. Believing the person might have fallen down the steep embankment, the couple immediately contacted authorities. A deputy arrived less than 15 minutes later and searched both sides of the bridge using high-powered flashlights. Fresh rain earlier that evening had softened the muddy ground surrounding the roadside, creating excellent conditions for preserving footprints. Investigators found no tire tracks, footprints, or signs that anyone had recently climbed the embankment. The creek below remained shallow enough that an injured person could not have been carried away by the current. After completing a thorough search, the deputy concluded that the witnesses had probably mistaken a tree stump or roadside marker for a person while driving through darkness. The report was filed without further investigation. 2 nights later, dispatch received another call involving the exact same location. This time, the witness was an experienced commercial truck driver transporting livestock across the state. Unlike the previous callers, he carried a continuously recording dashboard camera. According to his report, he noticed what appeared to be a person standing beside the bridge long before reaching the location because the reflective stripes on the figure's clothing briefly caught his headlights. Expecting someone to wave for help, he reduced speed while preparing to stop. Instead, the figure remained motionless until the truck rounded the final curve. At that point, it disappeared from view. The driver immediately checked both side mirrors, expecting to see someone walking along the shoulder. The road behind him remained completely empty. Investigators obtained the dashboard camera footage, hoping it would identify the individual. The recording confirmed that the driver slowed significantly while approaching the bridge. It also showed a faint upright shape near the roadside, lasting only a fraction of a second before disappearing behind the truck's headlights. Image specialists enhanced the footage repeatedly, but could not determine whether the object represented a person, vegetation, or a brief lighting distortion caused by moisture on the camera lens. The video neither confirmed nor disproved the driver's statement, leaving detectives with evidence that raised more questions than answers. The investigation expanded after 3 additional motorists reported remarkably similar experiences during the following week. None of the witnesses knew one another, and each contacted emergency dispatch before local media became aware of the earlier reports. Every statement described the same section of Hollow Creek Road. Every witness believed they had seen someone standing beside the abandoned bridge. Every search conducted immediately afterward found nothing. Detectives carefully compared timelines, weather conditions, traffic volume, and witness backgrounds, expecting to identify a common factor linking the reports. The only consistent element remained the location itself. Rather than increasing routine patrols, the sheriff assigned 2 deputies to remain hidden near the bridge during several consecutive nights. Their objective was simple. If someone was deliberately frightening motorists, officers intended to intercept the individual before another emergency call occurred. The deputies positioned their vehicles well away from the highway and monitored the bridge using night vision equipment. Hours passed without incident. Shortly before midnight on the 3rd night, one deputy observed a vehicle suddenly slowing as it approached the bridge before accelerating away moments later. Dispatch immediately received another call from the driver reporting a person standing beside the roadway. The deputies reached the exact location in less than 40 seconds. Once again, nobody was there. Following that incident, engineers from the Tennessee Department of Transportation inspected the roadway, searching for reflective signs, damaged guardrails, unusual shadows, or roadside objects capable of creating the illusion of a standing person under certain lighting conditions. Surveyors mapped every tree, utility pole, and roadside marker visible from approaching vehicles. Computer simulations using identical vehicle headlights failed to recreate the appearance consistently described by witnesses. Although several combinations of shadows briefly resembled human shapes, none matched the reported height, position, or timing documented throughout the investigation. Detectives reluctantly ruled out the possibility that every witness had experienced the same optical illusion. As investigators reviewed older county archives, they discovered something unexpected. Nearly 23 years earlier, highway maintenance supervisors had submitted several reports describing motorists stopping along the same bridge after believing someone had been standing beside the road. Those reports contained no mention of ghost stories, local legends, or supernatural explanations. Instead, maintenance crews requested additional warning signs because drivers repeatedly braked unexpectedly while passing through the area after dark. The request was eventually denied after engineers failed to identify any roadway hazard requiring corrective action. The documents were quietly archived and forgotten until the current investigation brought them to light decades later. The sheriff officially closed the case after 6 weeks without identifying a suspect, uncovering evidence of criminal activity, or documenting additional reports. No missing persons were connected to the location, and no witnesses ever claimed the figure attempted to approach their vehicles or communicate with them. Detectives deliberately avoided labeling the incident as paranormal, concluding only that repeated witness observations could not be explained using the available evidence. Even today, Hollow Creek Road remains open to public traffic, carrying thousands of vehicles every year without incident. Yet, among local deputies who worked the investigation, one memory has endured. Every driver who reported the mysterious figure described the same reaction before contacting emergency dispatch. None believed they had encountered a ghost. Every one of them believed they had seen an ordinary person who desperately needed help. That simple assumption was exactly what brought them back to the bridge, and exactly what they could never explain. In this new story, there is a particular kind of silence that settles over small Appalachian towns during the final weeks of summer. By August, the days are still warm, but darkness arrives a little earlier. Porch lights appear before dinner is finished, and the forests surrounding isolated communities seem to grow larger after sunset. Most nights pass without anything worth remembering. But in August of 2019, families living along a quiet valley in Western Virginia began noticing something strange. It always happened between midnight and 3 in the morning. Nobody disappeared, no homes were broken into, and no crime was ever established. Yet before the month ended, several families had stopped sleeping upstairs, children were staying with relatives, and deputies were quietly driving the same roads every night, trying to discover who kept leaving the porch lights on at houses where nobody lived. The valley contained fewer than 40 occupied homes scattered along 7 miles of narrow road between 2 forested ridges. Many properties had belonged to the same families for generations. Several older houses stood empty after their owners died or moved closer to larger towns, leaving dark windows and overgrown yards between occupied residences. Everyone knew which houses were vacant. That familiarity was important because the first unusual report involved an abandoned farmhouse that had not received electricity in nearly 11 years. Shortly after 1 o'clock on August 4th, a woman living across the valley noticed its front porch light glowing steadily through the trees. She watched it for several minutes before deciding someone must have purchased the property. By morning, the light was gone. 2 days later, her husband walked to the farmhouse expecting to find contractors or signs of recent activity. The grass surrounding the building remained waist high. A chain still secured the front gate, and fallen branches blocked part of the driveway. Through a broken basement window, he could see that the electrical meter had been removed from the exterior wall years earlier. Nothing suggested anyone had entered the property. He mentioned the light to a neighbor who immediately described seeing something similar at another vacant house farther north during the previous night. That house had been empty since a fire damaged its kitchen 5 years earlier. Its porch light had also appeared shortly after midnight. The neighbors initially treated the incidents as an odd coincidence. Reflections from passing vehicles could create convincing illusions along the valley, especially when humid summer air settled close to the ground. That explanation became harder to accept after a third light appeared. On August 9th, a retired schoolteacher woke shortly before 2 in the morning and noticed a bright yellow glow outside her bedroom window. An abandoned cottage stood across the road approximately 100 yards from her property. Its porch was illuminated clearly enough that she could see the railing and front steps. She watched from her window for nearly 15 minutes. No vehicle approached, nobody crossed the yard. Then the lights switched off instantly. The following morning, she contacted the county sheriff's office. A deputy inspected the cottage and discovered that the electrical service had been disconnected 8 years earlier. The porch fixture still contained an old bulb, but wiring inside the wall had deteriorated badly enough that an electrician later confirmed it could not have operated normally. There were no footprints around the building and no signs of forced entry. The deputy considered the possibility of someone using a battery-powered lamp positioned behind the fixture as a prank, but removing the glass cover revealed years of dirt and insects that appeared completely undisturbed. The incident was documented and initially classified as suspicious activity. During the next week, the report spread along the valley. 5 vacant houses were involved, each separated by significant distance. Residents consistently described only one illuminated porch at a time. The light usually appeared after midnight and remained visible for several minutes before disappearing. Nobody reported seeing lights inside the houses themselves. Nobody saw vehicles parked nearby. More importantly, the sequence seemed to move gradually north. The first report came from the southern end of the valley. Each later sighting occurred at another abandoned property farther along the same road. By August 15th, deputies realized the next vacant house in that direction stood directly beside an occupied home containing a family with 2 young children. Rather than waiting for another report, 2 deputies parked their patrol vehicles away from the road and watched the property overnight. They arrived before 11 and inspected the abandoned house while daylight remained. Every door was secured, every room was empty, and the porch light had no functioning electrical connection. One deputy positioned himself in woodland overlooking the front entrance, while the second remained inside an unmarked vehicle farther down the road. For almost 3 hours, nothing happened. Then, at 1:38 a.m., the deputy in the woods radioed that the porch had become illuminated. The second deputy reached the house in less than a minute. By then, the light had disappeared. Both officers searched the building and surrounding property using flashlights and thermal equipment. They found no person. The doors remained locked, windows remained secured, and vegetation surrounding the porch showed no evidence that anyone had recently walked through it. The officer who witnessed the light was certain it had originated near the porch ceiling rather than from passing headlights. His body camera had been operating throughout the observation, but the house stood near the edge of the recording's visible range. The footage showed a faint increase in brightness for approximately 40 seconds before darkness returned. It could not identify the source. The sheriff's office increased overnight patrols without publicly discussing the pattern. Investigators worried that publicity might encourage copycats and make the original activity impossible to separate from pranks. Meanwhile, residents began changing their routines. Some closed curtains before sunset, others installed motion lights and cameras. Several families began leaving dogs indoors overnight. The atmosphere throughout the valley changed despite nothing openly threatening having occurred. People were not frightened because someone had attacked them. They were frightened because something appeared to be moving slowly from one abandoned house to the next, and nobody knew what would happen when there were no empty houses left. On August 19th, that question became more difficult to ignore. The next property north had been abandoned only temporarily. Its owner, an 80-year-old widower, was recovering from surgery at his daughter's home several counties away. A neighbor watching the property noticed the porch light illuminated at 2:06 a.m. and immediately contacted deputies. Officers arrived while the light was still visible from the road. According to the incident report, it disappeared as the first patrol vehicle entered the driveway. Deputies searched the house and found nothing disturbed. Unlike the earlier properties, this home still had active electricity. Examination of the security system showed something unexpected. The porch light switch inside the locked house had physically moved into the on position. The homeowner insisted he had switched every exterior light off before leaving. Investigators could not prove otherwise. There was no smart home system, timer, or remote control connected to the fixture. Someone inside the house could easily have operated the switch, yet cameras installed at neighboring properties showed no person approaching or leaving during the relevant period. Doors showed no evidence of tampering. Windows remained locked from inside. Nothing was stolen. The incident provided the first clear evidence that the phenomenon might involve actual human interference, but it simultaneously made that possibility harder to understand. 3 nights passed without another light. Residents began hoping the strange sequence had ended. Then, shortly after midnight on August 23rd, something entirely different happened. A family living near the northern end of the valley woke to their front porch, light turning on. Their house was occupied. The father checked the hallway and confirmed everyone was inside. He walked toward the front room, expecting an electrical problem. Before reaching the door, he noticed a shadow moving across the curtains from outside. It passed slowly from one side of the porch to the other and stopped near the front steps. He immediately moved his family into an upstairs bedroom and contacted emergency dispatch. Deputies arrived 7 minutes later. The porch light remained on. Nobody was outside. Fresh mud covered part of the yard after an afternoon storm, yet no footprints approached the porch from the road or surrounding forest. Investigators searched beneath the house, behind nearby sheds, and along the creek bordering the property. Nothing was found. A motion-activated camera mounted above the garage had recorded the entire front yard. At 12:17 a.m., the porch light activated. Approximately 9 seconds later, the camera briefly adjusted its exposure as though something had moved close to the porch. No person appeared anywhere in the recording. The light remained on until the homeowner eventually switched it off after deputies completed their search. That became the final incident reported during August. The sheriff's office continued patrols through September, but no additional porch lights appeared unexpectedly. Investigators examined electrical systems at several affected properties, interviewed residents, reviewed camera recordings, and searched for connections between previous owners. Nothing produced a convincing explanation. The abandoned houses belonged to unrelated families. Their electrical conditions varied significantly. Some had functioning wiring, while others had been disconnected from the grid for years. There was no evidence linking the incidents to trespassers, teenagers, former residents, or anyone living nearby. Years later, several of the abandoned houses were demolished or renovated. New families moved into 2 properties without reporting anything unusual. The valley returned to the quiet routine it had known before that summer. Children grew older, residents moved away, and many people stopped discussing what happened. Yet, those who lived there during August 2019 still remember the order in which the lights appeared. One house after another, always moving north, always after midnight, always illuminating a porch where nobody should have been standing. The strangest detail was discovered much later when a retired deputy reviewed his notes while preparing old records for storage. He plotted every affected property on a county map and noticed something investigators had overlooked during the original response. The houses were not merely arranged from south to north. Each successive property stood almost exactly the same distance farther along the road. When the final occupied house was added to the sequence, the pattern formed a steady progression through the valley, as though something had been stopping at one porch every few nights before continuing toward the next. There should have been one more stop. Less than a mile beyond the final house stood another abandoned property hidden behind trees at the northern edge of the valley. Investigators had never included it because no unusual activity was reported there. When the retired deputy checked historical property records, he discovered why. The house had been demolished on August 22nd, one day before the porch light appeared at the occupied family's home instead. Nobody has ever established whether that timing meant anything. No official report describes the incidents as paranormal, and everyone involved accepts that an ordinary explanation may still exist. But for the families who spent those quiet August nights watching lights move slowly closer through the mountains, one question remains difficult to forget. If that last abandoned house had still been standing, would the light have stopped there instead? In this new story, on August 9, 2022, the Tennessee Highway Patrol opened an investigation after receiving 3 unrelated reports involving the same stretch of U.S. play. Highway 421 near the Tennessee-Virginia border. None of the callers reported a collision, a disabled vehicle, or a crime in progress. Instead, each described encountering a dark-colored pickup truck parked along the shoulder shortly after midnight with its headlights switched off. What immediately caught investigators' attention was that every witness provided nearly identical details despite contacting dispatch separately over a period of 45 minutes. By the time the first trooper reached the reported location, the truck had disappeared. At first, investigators assumed the driver had simply continued down the highway. Over the following week, however, evidence began suggesting that the 3 motorists had not witnessed the same event at all, despite believing they had. The investigation centered on a remote section of highway crossing steep Appalachian ridges where cellular reception frequently disappeared for several miles at a time. Although the road remained well-maintained, long curves and heavy tree cover limited visibility after sunset. Traffic volume dropped significantly after 11 o'clock, leaving many drivers traveling alone for extended periods. Highway patrol records showed relatively few serious accidents in the area, making the cluster of nearly identical reports stand out immediately. Detectives began by locating the 3 motorists, all of whom agreed to provide detailed written statements before learning anything about the other reports. The first witness, a traveling nurse returning home after a weekend shift, reported passing the parked pickup at approximately 12:18 a.m. She noticed the vehicle because it appeared unusually clean for a truck sitting partially on the gravel shoulder. According to her statement, the driver's door remained closed, no interior lights were visible, and no emergency flashers had been activated. Believing the driver might need assistance, she slowed briefly before deciding not to stop because she could see no one outside the vehicle. She continued driving without giving the incident further thought until hearing about the investigation several days later. 17 minutes later, a commercial delivery driver contacted emergency dispatch after observing what he believed was the same pickup approximately 3 miles farther north. Unlike the previous witness, he recalled seeing the driver's side door standing open while the headlights remained off. He reduced speed, expecting someone to emerge from the darkness beside the road, yet no movement appeared anywhere near the truck. Dashboard camera footage from his vehicle confirmed that a pickup had indeed been parked on the shoulder, but the grainy nighttime recording failed to capture enough detail for investigators to identify the license plate or determine whether anyone had been nearby. The third report arrived shortly before 1 o'clock from a retired firefighter driving toward Bristol after visiting relatives. His description matched the previous witnesses in almost every respect except for one important detail. He insisted the pickup had been parked facing the opposite direction from normal traffic flow. Initially, investigators believed the witness had simply become disoriented while driving through the mountain curves after midnight. Accident reconstruction specialists later visited the location and determined that his description of the vehicle's orientation accurately matched physical tire marks discovered beside the highway later that morning. Troopers searched the entire section of highway before sunrise without locating the pickup. Instead, investigators found fresh tire impressions leading from the shoulder toward an abandoned gravel access road that had once served a nearby communications tower. The road ended less than half a mile later at a locked security gate overlooking a steep ravine. Officers found no vehicle beyond the gate and no evidence suggesting a truck had turned around within the narrow clearing. Drone surveys conducted after daylight confirmed there were no alternative exits, hidden trails, or recent signs of off-road travel capable of explaining where the pickup had gone. Detectives next examined surveillance footage collected from service stations, convenience stores, and highway cameras covering every possible route leading toward the reported location. Investigators expected to identify the pickup entering or leaving the area within a predictable time frame. Instead, analysts discovered that no camera captured a vehicle matching the witness's descriptions after approximately 11:40 p.m. before the first emergency call. Every highway connecting to the remote section had at least one functioning traffic camera, yet none recorded a dark-colored pickup during the period in question. The absence of digital evidence became one of the most difficult aspects of the investigation because it conflicted directly with 3 independent witness accounts and partial dashboard camera footage. Forensic specialists inspected the tire impressions recovered from the gravel shoulder. Measurements indicated a full-size pickup equipped with all-terrain tires, but the tracks ended abruptly where the gravel access road met exposed bedrock near the communications site. Search teams expanded their examination well beyond the immediate area, covering wooded slopes, drainage channels, and abandoned maintenance roads. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging searched throughout the following night, while officers checked nearby storage buildings and isolated cabins. No vehicle matching the descriptions was ever located. Investigators ultimately concluded that the tire impressions confirmed a truck had reached the access road, but offered no evidence explaining how it had left. Several months later, analysts completed a synchronized reconstruction using dispatch logs, vehicle telematics from the delivery truck, dashboard camera timestamps, and the responding trooper's GPS records. The reconstruction revealed an unexpected inconsistency. Based on verified travel times, the 3 motorists could not all have observed the same pickup. According to the timeline, the vehicle would have needed to travel between reported locations faster than physically possible without passing one of the witnesses who had been continuously driving the highway. Investigators carefully reviewed every timestamp multiple times before accepting the conclusion. The reports remained individually credible, yet together they described movements that could not be reconciled. The case was eventually closed after detectives exhausted every investigative lead. No missing vehicles matching the available description were reported anywhere in Tennessee or Virginia during the relevant period. No abandoned pickup was recovered in surrounding counties, and no evidence suggested that the motorists had coordinated their accounts before contacting authorities. The official report classified the incident as an unresolved suspicious circumstance rather than a criminal investigation, noting that insufficient evidence existed to identify either the vehicle or its driver. Among Highway Patrol investigators, however, the case continues to circulate during training discussions because it demonstrates how multiple reliable witness statements can sometimes reinforce one another while simultaneously making a case far more difficult to explain. For travelers who regularly drive isolated Appalachian highways after midnight, it remains one of those investigations where every documented fact appears trustworthy, yet the complete story still refuses to fit together. In this new story, there are certain summer memories that never seem to fade. People remember the sound of cicadas after sunset, screen doors closing behind them, and warm August air drifting through open bedroom windows. In small Appalachian communities, those memories often belong to a quieter America when families spent evenings on porches and children stayed outside until darkness covered the mountains. But for residents of one isolated community in southwestern Virginia, August of 2017 became associated with something entirely different. It began with children noticing someone standing beside an old country road after sunset. Within 2 weeks, adults had seen the same figure. By the end of the month, deputies were patrolling the valley every night. Nobody ever discovered who the stranger was, where he came from, or why he always appeared several miles closer to town each time someone saw him. The first report came from two teenage brothers riding bicycles home shortly before 9 o'clock on August 5th. Their family lived outside a community of fewer than 700 residents, surrounded by forest and abandoned farmland. The boys had spent the afternoon fishing at a creek several miles from home and were returning before complete darkness. About halfway through the journey, they noticed someone standing beside a weathered fence near an abandoned dairy farm. The figure appeared to be an older man wearing dark pants and a pale, long-sleeved shirt. He did not wave or attempt to stop them. He simply stood beside the road, facing the surrounding fields. The brothers continued riding and told their father after reaching home. He assumed they had seen a local farmer or someone checking property boundaries. The abandoned dairy farm still belonged to a family living several counties away, and hunters occasionally crossed the surrounding land. Nothing about the story seemed particularly unusual. 2 evenings later, however, an elderly woman living almost 2 miles south of the farm noticed someone matching the same description standing beside her mailbox shortly after sunset. She watched from her kitchen window, expecting the stranger to approach the house. Instead, he remained beside the road for several minutes before she briefly looked away. When she returned to the window, he was gone. The woman mentioned the incident to a neighbor who contacted the county sheriff because several isolated properties had recently experienced minor thefts. A deputy arrived before midnight and searched the roadside. The ground near the mailbox was dry and offered little opportunity for recovering footprints. Nothing appeared damaged, and the homeowner reported nothing missing. The deputy drove several miles in both directions without finding anyone walking along the road. With no evidence of criminal activity, the incident was recorded as a suspicious person report and quickly forgotten. 4 nights later, another sighting occurred. This time, a delivery driver traveling through the valley after completing a late route noticed a man standing beside a narrow bridge nearly 3 miles south of the original dairy farm. The driver slowed because the road had no pedestrian shoulder and worried the man might step into traffic. According to his later statement, the stranger remained completely motionless as the van approached. His clothing looked unusually formal for someone walking through rural countryside during a humid August night. The driver remembered a pale shirt buttoned to the collar and dark trousers extending almost to worn black shoes. No backpack, flashlight, or vehicle was visible nearby. After passing the bridge, the driver looked in his side mirror. The man remained standing in exactly the same place. Less than 15 minutes later, the driver stopped at a convenience store and mentioned the encounter to an employee. The clerk immediately asked whether the man had been wearing a white shirt. That question changed the situation. The employee had already heard about the previous reports from residents farther north. The driver contacted the sheriff's office before leaving the store, providing the first detailed description collected from someone unfamiliar with the local stories. Deputies began comparing the 3 sightings. None of the witnesses knew one another personally. Their descriptions were remarkably similar, yet one detail attracted more attention than the clothing. Each sighting occurred farther south along the same road. The first location was beside the abandoned dairy farm. The second occurred near the woman's mailbox. The third happened at the narrow bridge. When investigators plotted the locations, the unidentified man appeared to be moving steadily toward the center of the community, despite nobody ever seeing him walking between locations. Patrols increased during the following week. Deputies drove the road after sunset, while residents were encouraged to report anyone walking alone. Officers expected the mystery to end quickly. The stranger was probably a transient traveler, a local resident experiencing confusion, or someone deliberately frightening people. Every explanation required the same thing. Eventually, someone should see him moving from one place to another. Nobody did. On August 14th, a family returning from dinner encountered the figure approximately 1 mile beyond the bridge. Their dashboard camera was operating at the time. The recording later showed the family's vehicle traveling along an empty road before the headlights illuminated something near the right shoulder. For less than 3 seconds, a human-shaped figure appeared beside a utility pole. The image was blurred by motion and darkness, but investigators could distinguish light-colored clothing above darker legs. The driver slowed immediately. By the time the vehicle stopped and reversed approximately 100 feet, the roadside was empty. Deputies arrived 9 minutes later and searched the area using flashlights and a tracking dog. The dog briefly followed a scent from the utility pole toward an overgrown field before stopping near a collapsed stone wall. Beyond the wall stood nearly 40 acres of abandoned farmland surrounded by forest. Officers searched until after midnight without locating anyone. No fresh campsites, discarded food, clothing, or evidence of long-term occupation were discovered. The property owner confirmed nobody had permission to stay there. The dashboard recording was examined by investigators the following morning. It clearly documented something beside the road, but the resolution was too poor to identify a face or determine age. Detectives could not even establish whether the person captured in the video was the same individual described by earlier witnesses. What they could confirm was that someone or something roughly human in size had been present when the vehicle approached. For the first time, the strange reports were no longer based entirely on memory. News of the footage spread quietly through the community. Parents began collecting children before sunset, evening walkers changed routes, several residents installed inexpensive security cameras facing the road. Nothing openly dangerous had occurred, but the pattern itself made people uncomfortable. The stranger never approached anyone. He never asked for assistance. He never entered a yard while being watched. He simply appeared beside the road, remained there long enough to be noticed, and vanished before anyone could determine where he went. The next sighting occurred on August 18th, less than half a mile from the first cluster of occupied houses. A retired coal miner sitting on his porch noticed the stranger beneath a streetlight shortly after 10 o'clock. Unlike previous witnesses, he watched for several minutes without looking away. The man stood with his back partly toward the house, facing south toward town. The homeowner considered calling out, but decided against it. Instead, he went inside and contacted dispatch while continuing to watch through the front window. The dispatcher remained on the line while a patrol unit approached from the south. The homeowner could still see the stranger when the deputy reported being less than 1 minute away. Then a passing pickup briefly blocked the homeowner's view. The interruption lasted only several seconds. When the road became visible again, the man had disappeared. The deputy arrived almost immediately. The pickup driver was stopped several miles away and questioned. He remembered seeing the homeowner on his porch, but had noticed nobody standing beneath the streetlight. Investigators searched the area carefully. Behind the streetlight was an open field extending nearly 200 yards before reaching the forest. Anyone attempting to run from the road should have remained visible beneath the moonlit sky. The homeowner insisted nobody cross the field. Deputies found no person hiding nearby. Security footage from a residence farther south showed the responding patrol vehicle approaching the location, but captured no pedestrian leaving beforehand. By then, investigators had documented 5 sightings across 13 days. When plotted on a map, every location followed the same road south. The distance between sightings was decreasing. More importantly, the final location stood only a little over 1 mile from the center of town. Deputies did not publicly discuss that detail, but additional patrol units began remaining in the community overnight. For 6 nights, nothing happened. The absence of reports gradually reduced anxiety. Some residents believed the stranger had realized police were searching for him and left the area. Others suspected the entire sequence had involved several unrelated people whose appearances had become connected through rumor. Investigators considered that explanation increasingly likely. Similar clothing and poor nighttime visibility could easily cause witnesses to describe different individuals as the same person. Then came August 25th. Shortly before 11:30, the county emergency dispatcher received a call from the caretaker of a small church near the center of town. The caretaker had returned to retrieve paperwork left after an evening meeting. As he pulled into the parking lot, his headlights illuminated a man standing near the church cemetery. The description immediately matched the earlier reports. Pale long-sleeved shirt, dark trousers, no visible vehicle, no flashlight. The caretaker remained inside his locked truck and contacted dispatch. 2 deputies were already nearby and arrived in less than 4 minutes. The stranger remained visible for most of that time. According to the caretaker, he never moved toward the cemetery or the surrounding woods. He simply stood near the entrance facing the road. When the first patrol vehicle appeared around the corner, the caretaker glanced toward its flashing lights. When he looked back, the stranger was gone. Deputies immediately surrounded the cemetery. The property contained open grass bordered by a low stone wall and thick forest along its northern edge. Search dogs examined the entrance and several nearby graves, but failed to establish a usable trail. Officers remained until after 2 in the morning. Nothing suggested another person had recently crossed the cemetery. The caretaker's truck camera had captured part of the encounter, but the stranger stood outside the central field of view. Only a narrow, pale shape could be seen near the edge of several frames before disappearing. Investigators expected another sighting within days. None came. August ended quietly. September passed without another report. Patrols eventually returned to normal, and residents resumed evening routines. The unidentified stranger was never located, and no missing person matching his description was discovered in surrounding counties. No criminal activity could be connected to any of the sightings. With nothing further to investigate, the file was eventually closed. Years later, a local historian reviewing old property records discovered something that brought the story back into conversation. The road followed by the sightings had not always been a continuous highway. Before modern construction, it connected several farms with a railway depot that once stood near the center of town. Workers living in the Northern Valley commonly walked the route when traveling to the station. The depot had been demolished in the 1960s, but its former location could still be identified using historical maps. When the historian plotted the sightings against the old map, the progression ended less than 200 yards from where the railway platform had once stood. That coincidence fascinated residents, but proved nothing. Thousands of people had traveled the road during the decades when the station operated, and no record identified anyone matching the stranger. Investigators never treated the historical connection as evidence. Still, those who had seen the man found it difficult to ignore. The teenage brothers who witnessed the first appearance are adults now. The retired miner eventually moved away. The church caretaker stopped working nights years ago. None claims to have encountered a ghost. Most accept that an ordinary man probably walked through the valley that August and somehow avoided every attempt to locate him. But one question continues to follow the story. If the stranger was simply walking toward town, why did nobody ever see him walking? Every sighting placed him farther along the same route. Nobody saw him between those places. Nobody saw him arrive. Nobody saw him leave. He appeared beside the road after darkness, stood silently facing south, and vanished whenever attention shifted for only a few seconds. Then, after reaching the place where travelers once waited to leave the valley by train, he was never reported again. For the people who lived there, that is why those August nights remain difficult to forget. nothing attacked them. Nothing chased their cars or entered their homes. The fear came from watching a pattern unfold slowly enough that everyone could see where it was heading while nobody could explain what was creating it. And years later, whenever longtime residents remember the warm nights of August 2017, some still remember the pale shirt beside the road and wonder where the stranger was trying to go. In this news story, most ghost stories are impossible to verify because they survive only through rumor, family tradition, or stories repeated over generations. Investigators rarely pay attention to those accounts because they usually contain little evidence beyond personal belief. Every so often, however, an incident emerges that attracts the attention of law enforcement, emergency responders, and independent witnesses at the same time. Those cases are remembered not because anyone proved the existence of ghosts, but because every documented fact resisted ordinary explanation. One of the most discussed incidents of that kind began during the autumn of 2016 inside an abandoned elementary school hidden among the hills of eastern Kentucky. What started as a routine trespassing complaint eventually became a case that local investigators still remember years later. The Red Hollow Elementary School had been closed for nearly 14 years after declining enrollment forced the district to consolidate several rural campuses. Since then, the building had remained empty while ownership slowly transferred between county agencies. Electricity, water, and heating systems had all been disconnected, leaving the school exposed to years of harsh Appalachian winters. Although occasional vandals broke windows or painted graffiti inside the gymnasium, deputies rarely considered the property a significant concern. The building sat nearly 2 miles from the nearest occupied home, hidden behind thick woods that discouraged casual visitors. Most local residents eventually forgot the school still existed until several unrelated reports began arriving within the same month. The first report came from 2 utility contractors inspecting damaged telephone lines after a powerful windstorm. While driving past the abandoned school shortly after sunrise, both men noticed lights glowing inside what had once been the second-floor library. Assuming renovation crews had entered the building without notifying the utility company, they continued their inspection before mentioning the observation to county dispatch later that afternoon. Records immediately confirmed that no maintenance work had been scheduled anywhere on the property. Deputies briefly inspected the exterior before finding every entrance secured with rusted chains, exactly as documented during the previous county inspection only 3 weeks earlier. Several nights later, the County Volunteer Fire Department received an emergency call reporting possible smoke coming from the school roof. Firefighters arrived expecting an electrical fire despite knowing the building had no active power service. Upon reaching the property, they discovered no flames, no smoke, and no heat anywhere inside the structure. Thermal imaging cameras detected only normal temperature differences caused by cooling, concrete, and broken windows exposed to the night air. Before leaving, however, one firefighter quietly mentioned noticing what appeared to be movement at the far end of an upstairs hallway while searching the building. Other crew members dismissed the observation as shifting flashlight reflections, and the incident received little additional attention. The investigation changed during the second week of October when a deputy sheriff conducting routine patrol noticed something unusual while driving along the county highway below the hillside. Through gaps in the trees, he briefly observed several classroom windows reflecting a warm yellow glow, unlike ordinary sunrise or vehicle headlights. Curious, after hearing earlier reports, he drove directly to the property. By the time he reached the parking lot, less than 4 minutes later, every window had returned to complete darkness. The deputy searched the entire building alone before requesting additional officers. Dust covered every classroom floor, fallen ceiling tiles blocked several hallways, and years of accumulated debris remained completely undisturbed. There was no indication that another person had entered the school. Because multiple independent witnesses had now reported similar observations, detectives requested permission to install surveillance equipment throughout the building. Motion-activated cameras monitored every exterior entrance, while additional units covered the central staircase, library, gymnasium, and second-floor hallway where unusual activity had reportedly been observed. Audio recorders capable of operating continuously for several weeks were also placed inside the building to capture any sounds occurring overnight. Investigators expected the equipment to identify trespassers within days. Instead, nearly a month of recordings produced an entirely different puzzle. No unauthorized person was ever recorded entering or leaving the school. Even so, dispatch continued receiving occasional reports describing lights visible inside upper classroom windows before dawn. When technicians reviewed the surveillance recordings, they found nothing unusual on the video itself. Hallways remained empty, classrooms stayed dark, and exterior cameras showed no activity beyond wildlife crossing the parking lot. The audio recordings, however, attracted immediate attention. On 5 separate nights, microphones placed inside different sections of the school simultaneously captured faint sounds resembling lockers closing somewhere along the second-floor corridor. The sounds lasted only a few seconds before complete silence returned. Structural engineers later analyzed the recordings, suggesting that cooling metal pipes, loose ventilation ducts, or settling roof supports might produce similar noises. Yet none of those explanations accounted for the remarkable consistency in timing and location across every recording. Seeking a practical explanation, investigators invited engineers specializing in abandoned structures to examine the school from foundation to roof. Every electrical conduit, maintenance tunnel, attic space, and basement storage room was carefully inspected. Specialists searched for hidden occupants, illegal electrical connections, battery-powered lighting, or evidence that someone had secretly lived inside the building. They discovered nothing beyond expected storm damage and years of gradual deterioration. Even the upstairs library, where witnesses consistently reported seeing lights contained only empty shelves, broken furniture, and shattered windows overlooking the surrounding forest. No hidden equipment capable of producing the reported glow was ever found. As detectives expanded their investigation, county archives revealed something unexpected. Maintenance records from the early 1980s documented several complaints filed by evening custodians describing unexplained lights appearing inside empty classrooms after electrical circuits had been switched off during renovation work. At the time, supervisors concluded faulty wiring probably caused the reports, although electricians later found no defects requiring repair. The records contained only brief references and were forgotten for decades until investigators compared them with the current witness statements. Although separated by more than 30 years, both groups consistently identified the same section of the second floor overlooking the eastern hillside. The school remained under periodic observation throughout the winter, but reports gradually became less frequent before stopping altogether after the county approved demolition the following summer. Contractors dismantled the aging structure over several weeks while investigators remained on site, hoping demolition might expose concealed rooms, hidden access points, or forgotten electrical equipment overlooked during previous inspections. None was discovered. Once the final walls disappeared and the property was cleared, every report connected to the abandoned school came to an end. No similar observations have been documented there since. Today, the official investigation remains archived as an unresolved suspicious incident rather than a criminal case. Detectives involved have repeatedly emphasized that nothing uncovered during the inquiry proved the presence of ghosts or any other supernatural cause. Nevertheless, they also acknowledge that several important questions remain unanswered. Independent witnesses reported nearly identical observations without knowing one another. Emergency responders personally experienced unusual events while searching the building. Surveillance equipment failed to identify trespassers despite weeks of monitoring. Engineers eliminated every practical explanation they could reproduce. In the end, the case became memorable not because anyone proved a haunting had occurred, but because every reasonable explanation quietly disappeared long before the questions did. For those who worked the investigation, it remains one of the true ghost encounters that no one involved has ever completely forgotten. In this new story, for most Americans, hitchhiking belongs to another era. During the 1960s, 70s, and even into the early 80s, it was common to see travelers standing beside rural highways carrying backpacks, duffel bags, or cardboard signs listing their destinations. Today, the practice has nearly disappeared, replaced by smartphones, ride-sharing apps, and growing concerns about personal safety. Yet, across Appalachia, where isolated roads still connect hundreds of small communities, sheriff departments continue receiving occasional reports involving hitchhikers whose stories leave investigators with more questions than answers. Some reports involve stranded travelers. Others involve motorists who later insisted they picked up someone who seemed perfectly ordinary until the journey took an unexpected turn. The following case remains one of the strangest ever documented along the back roads of eastern Kentucky. During the final week of October 2017, 49-year-old Daniel Brooks left Pikeville, Kentucky, shortly after sunset following a routine maintenance inspection at a communications tower. Daniel had worked as a field technician for nearly 20 years and often drove remote mountain roads long after dark. Friends described him as practical, patient, and difficult to rattle. His truck contained emergency supplies, extra fuel, recovery equipment, and printed county maps in case his navigation system failed. He had traveled nearly every road in eastern Kentucky and believed there were very few surprises left in the Appalachian Mountains. Around 8:45 that evening, Daniel entered Kentucky Route 80 while taking a shortcut toward Prestonsburg. Traffic was unusually light. During nearly 30 minutes of driving, he encountered only two other vehicles. Autumn leaves covered the shoulders, while patches of low fog settled inside narrow valleys below the highway. The temperature had fallen into the upper 30s, making it unlikely anyone would be walking along such an isolated road. That assumption changed when Daniel rounded a sharp curve and saw a man standing beside an old wooden guardrail illuminated by his headlights. The stranger appeared to be in his late 60s. He wore a faded brown jacket, denim overalls, and carried a small canvas bag over one shoulder. He did not wave frantically or step into the roadway. Instead, he simply raised one hand as Daniel approached. Years working throughout rural Appalachia had taught Daniel that helping stranded travelers was still common in many mountain communities. He slowed, unlocked the passenger door, and asked where the man was headed. The stranger smiled politely before answering, just a little farther down the road. His voice was calm, almost reassuring, with the slow Appalachian accent Daniel had heard throughout his childhood. As they continued driving, the conversation remained surprisingly ordinary. The man introduced himself only as Walter and claimed he had been visiting relatives in a nearby hollow after attending a funeral earlier that afternoon. He spoke about abandoned coal camps, old churches disappearing from the mountains, and how many young people had moved away searching for work. Nothing about the discussion seemed unusual. Daniel later told investigators that Walter sounded exactly like dozens of older residents he had met during years working throughout eastern Kentucky. If anything, he seemed grateful simply to have someone willing to talk during a lonely drive through the mountains. After nearly 15 minutes, Walter pointed toward a narrow gravel road branching away from the highway. There were no reflective signs, no visible houses, and no mailbox identifying the road. Daniel slowed before asking whether anyone actually lived there. Walter quietly nodded and replied, "Used to be a whole community." The answer struck Daniel as oddly phrased. Before he could ask another question, Walter looked toward the dark forest beyond the windshield and added, "Most folks don't stop around here anymore, probably for the best." Daniel offered to drive him farther down the gravel road, but Walter immediately declined. Instead, he asked to be dropped off exactly where the pavement ended. Daniel stopped beside a rusted cattle gate partially hidden beneath vines. Walter thanked him, stepped from the truck, and walked slowly into the darkness carrying the same small canvas bag. Daniel watched through the side mirror until the man disappeared beyond the gate. Satisfied that his passenger had reached home safely, he continued toward Prestonsburg. Less than 5 minutes later, his truck radio suddenly filled with heavy static before clearing on its own. He thought little of it until reaching home later that evening. The following weekend, Daniel mentioned the encounter while working with another technician who had lived in the area his entire life. When he described dropping an older man named Walter near the abandoned gravel road, his coworker became unusually quiet. After several moments, he asked Daniel whether the man had been wearing brown overalls and carrying a faded canvas bag. Daniel answered yes without hesitation. His coworker then explained that the description matched Walter Hensley, a retired coal miner who had died from a heart attack nearly 12 years earlier. At first, Daniel laughed, assuming someone else shared the same name. His coworker insisted there had never been another Walter Hensley living in that hollow. Curiosity eventually led Daniel to the Floyd County Historical Society, where volunteers maintained newspaper archives and cemetery records. They located Walter Hensley's obituary from November 2005. The accompanying photograph showed an older man wearing denim overalls and smiling exactly as Daniel remembered. Even the canvas bag hanging from Walter's shoulder appeared in one family photograph donated decades earlier. According to surviving relatives, the abandoned gravel road once led to a small mining settlement completely abandoned after flooding during the early 1990s. Today, little remained except broken foundations hidden beneath the forest. No permanent residents had lived there for years. Daniel never claimed he had encountered anything supernatural. During interviews, he consistently stated that he believed he had given a ride to a real person, someone with a normal voice, ordinary conversation, and detailed knowledge of the surrounding communities. Yet investigators could not explain how Walter disappeared so quickly after leaving the truck, why no other residents matched the description, or why Daniel accurately described personal details never mentioned until he later viewed the archived obituary. The sheriff's office found no evidence of criminal activity and officially closed the inquiry without further action. Stories like Daniel's continue circulating throughout Appalachia, often dismissed as misunderstandings, mistaken identity, or memories shaped by lonely mountain roads after dark. Most likely, there are perfectly reasonable explanations for every detail. Even so, experienced deputies, volunteer firefighters, and lifelong residents quietly share one piece of advice with newcomers exploring the back roads at night. If you decide to stop for a hitchhiker, pay close attention to where they ask you to let them out. Because sometimes the destination is no longer there, and sometimes the person thanking you for the ride has already been part of Appalachian history for many years. The new house seemed perfect until we heard someone upstairs. Deep within the historic suburban neighborhoods of Savannah, a young married couple purchased their beautiful colonial dream home. During the humid autumn of 2020, they completely renovated the massive historic wooden structure very carefully. What actually happened during their very first night indoors completely defies any basic, logical, modern scientific explanation today. Archive notes from the subsequent state police investigation describe a highly disturbing timeline of terrifying late-night events. 32-year-old Liam worked as a highly dedicated structural architect designing complex commercial office buildings daily. His highly capable wife was a 30-year-old financial accountant named Chloe, who frequently worked remotely indoors. Their primary professional goal required them to quickly establish a quiet, comfortable domestic life away from noisy apartments. The county file from 2009 actually mentioned several highly unusual trespassing complaints regarding this exact property. They officially arrived on October 12th and immediately began carefully unpacking their heavy cardboard boxes in the parlor. The first quiet afternoon passed entirely without any significant dangerous incidents as the exhausted couple arranged their furniture. State records confirm the regional weather forecast predicted clear skies and dropping temperatures for that entire dark night. However, Chloe woke up shortly after midnight because she clearly heard strange, heavy footsteps echoing above their ceiling. She initially assumed a large, heavy animal was aggressively exploring the completely unfinished, dusty, wooden, dark, hidden attic. When she cautiously listened closer, the heavy, rhythmic footsteps instantly ceased completely in the cold, oppressive, silent house. Liam quickly discovered a highly bizarre, locked, heavy wooden door blocking the narrow hallway leading toward the stairs. The strange, unexplainable, heavy door was perfectly solid, and it featured 3 massive modern steel deadbolts installed backwards. Some locals claimed a rogue, eccentric previous owner actively hid dangerous structural damage behind heavily reinforced wooden barricades. Investigators never confirmed those specific wild, unsubstantiated rumors and strictly maintained the property was entirely structurally safe generally. Liam carefully photographed the bizarre locked barricade and noted that the surrounding drywall showed extreme signs of stress. The highly stressful situation escalated drastically during that dark hour when an awful chemical smell suddenly arrived continuously. Reportedly, the foul, suffocating odor tightly resembled burning synthetic plastic mixed heavily with the sharp scent of sulfur. Both dedicated homeowners immediately started coughing violently and aggressively struggling to breathe properly inside their completely sealed bedroom. Liam quickly grabbed his portable emergency radio to call for immediate outside medical assistance, but only received static. Dispatch logs show no emergency distress calls were ever successfully officially recorded by the regional police department then. Suddenly, a massive, unseen, heavy physical force violently shook the solid foundation and violently rattled the thick windows. Liam scrambled frantically toward the dark hallway and desperately aimed his high-powered security flashlight toward the ceiling. The glowing beam instantly revealed an enormous, intense, dark mass standing perfectly still directly behind the stair banister. The strange, dark anomaly lacked any discernible biological features and completely blocked the normal, bright ambient light entirely. Records conflict regarding exactly how long they silently, terrifyingly watched the imposing tall anomaly before it slowly retreated. Chloe frantically, urgently insisted they absolutely needed to completely abandon their newly purchased historic home and run outside. Liam completely strongly agreed, but they soon realized the main electrical breaker panel was constantly displaying erratic sparks. They were effectively hopelessly trapped inside a massive, unforgiving structural maze known for permanently confusing, highly experienced contractors. The desperate, anxious architect decided to blindly, violently run toward the front door, hoping to retrieve his keys. He confidently, blindly sprinted continuously through the freezing dark living room until he eventually physically discovered the entrance. Liam remained entirely, completely, silently hidden behind the thick, solid wooden couch while intensely listening for aggressive movements. Archived notes from Liam stated he repeatedly caught brief, terrifying glimpses of pale, smooth, large objects moving swiftly. Every single time he abruptly, cautiously raised his head to firmly point out the hidden observer, they vanished. Utter physical, mental exhaustion eventually heavily forced him to quickly, carefully establish a completely vulnerable, unprotected defensive position. He huddled tightly, safely, against the heavy metal radiator while strongly clutching a heavy steel flashlight for protection. Around 2 in the freezing morning, the surrounding dark, dense house suddenly fell totally dead silent entirely, completely. A deep, guttural, mechanical humming sound slowly, continuously began to violently vibrate through the damp dirt beneath floorboards. Some locals claimed strange underground natural gas releases occasionally plagued the Savannah region, but geologists officially found nothing. Liam frantically aggressively scanned the pitch-black distant hallway with his heavy flashlight, but the expensive battery died. He silently screamed internally in absolute, sheer, unadulterated terror when a tall, pale, smooth shape casually stepped forward. The towering, featureless, pale entity did not overtly, aggressively attack the reinforced door, but simply stood motionless completely. Liam slowly, hesitantly gripped his heavy steel flashlight tightly, but his frozen, numb fingers were constantly heavily trembling. The bizarre, towering, unknown creature emitted another deep, deafening, humming vocalization that violently, instantly, completely shattered the windows. Plunged into total, suffocating, pitch-black darkness inside the house, the terrified young couple blindly, frantically crawled desperately. They hopelessly, blindly waited continuously inside the highly secure, locked basement room until the early morning sunlight arrived. A commercial utility repair operator miraculously happily found the rural property completely devastated near the heavily designated street. The highly traumatized young couple was severely, badly dehydrated and suffering from multiple minor bleeding lacerations from glass. State records confirm they were quickly, safely, immediately transported to a local regional medical hospital and strictly treated. When heavily armed local police deputies eventually carefully, safely navigated back to retrieve the abandoned property, they discovered chaos. The heavy, durable wooden interior doors were completely, entirely melted into toxic puddles, and all metal hinges twisted. Liam was tragically completely unable to mentally process his terrifying experience despite the massive, highly coordinated psychological support. Highly trained tracking search dogs completely, entirely lost any distinct individual scent trails near the steep property edge. Law enforcement officials strongly, firmly suspected the blindly, quickly fleeing couple accidentally, entirely hallucinated the terrifying, massive entity. However, they absolutely could not logically, realistically explain how the heavy steel locks were completely melted by temperatures. The overwhelming, putrid atmospheric sulfur smell and the highly localized underground ground vibrations also strictly remained completely unsolved. Chloe completely, permanently, fully abandoned her promising financial accounting career and rapidly moved to a highly bustling city. She completely, absolutely, strictly refused to conduct any further public media interviews regarding her terrifying, unexplainable house experiences. She eventually, quietly, safely, wrote a highly obscure, completely anonymous internet blog detailing her intense, lingering, severe trauma. Reportedly, she deeply, severely suffered from chronic, daily, heavy insomnia and constant, terrifying nightmares featuring tall, smooth entities. Dispatch logs routinely, regularly show she frequently, frantically called local urban police authorities, continually complaining about heavy vibrations. The deep, dark, isolated suburban Savannah house remains mostly completely, thoroughly abandoned and deeply, heavily feared by residents. Experienced local rural real estate agents actively, aggressively, strictly discourage overly ambitious amateur novice buyers from exploring acreage. Official public state records conflict regarding the actual, total, highly accurate number of missing trespasser cases strictly linked. Some ambitious, independent, amateur internet investigators occasionally, dangerously, completely venture into the dark, unmarked house hoping for evidence. Most of them always safely return completely empty-handed, while a few others quickly emerge with unsettling stories. The absolute, total, complete lack of any definitive, hard physical evidence heavily, continually, profoundly frustrates those who believe. The completely destroyed internal security cameras conveniently, completely, permanently erased any potential digital visual proof of the entity. Vociferous internet online skeptics constantly, loudly, aggressively argue that sheer blind panic and total utter darkness easily transformed. Archived notes, carefully, thoroughly gathered from the official local police investigation, confidently, strictly concluded that an undocumented leak, yet the exact, highly specific, true physical origin nature of those massive, perfectly smooth melted door frames remains. University, biology, science experts quickly, easily, permanently dismiss the crazy, ridiculous, bizarre idea of a completely unknown anomaly. They firmly, constantly, strongly argue that an active, healthy, massive biological population of large hidden creatures leaves evidence. No unusual biological organic hair samples or strange skeletal biological bone remains have ever been definitively positively linked. Some locals claimed the federal, national, centralized government quietly, aggressively, permanently suppressed the actual truth to protect operations. Investigators never confirmed any grand, illegal, hidden conspiracy and simply safely, permanently, officially closed the bizarre, terrifying case. In this new story, for more than a century, the mountains of West Virginia have challenged investigators in ways few other places have. Dense forests, abandoned mining roads, isolated valleys, and unpredictable weather have often complicated even the most straightforward investigations. Most missing hikers are eventually found. Most vehicle accidents are reconstructed. Most emergency calls end with reasonable explanations. Yet, every so often, a case emerges that refuses to fit within ordinary investigative methods. One such investigation began during the final weekend of September 2018, when a routine welfare check along an old fire tower road slowly transformed into one of the most perplexing unsolved cases ever handled by a rural sheriff's office. The investigation centered on Black Ridge, a heavily wooded mountain overlooking a small community in Pocahontas County. The ridge was accessible only by a narrow gravel road originally built decades earlier to service a now abandoned fire observation tower. Although hikers occasionally visited the summit during daylight hours, local residents rarely traveled the road after sunset because fallen trees, loose rock, and steep drop-offs made nighttime driving especially dangerous. On the evening of September 29th, a volunteer firefighter contacted the sheriff's office after noticing a blue station wagon parked beside the abandoned tower long after the surrounding recreation area had officially closed. The vehicle's headlights were off, yet its parking lights remained illuminated as though someone intended to return within a few minutes. Deputies arrived shortly before 11 o'clock, expecting to locate campers or photographers watching the stars from the summit. Instead, they found the station wagon completely empty. The keys remained in the ignition, the driver's wallet rested inside the center console, and a folded hiking map lay open across the passenger seat. The vehicle showed no signs of mechanical failure, recent collision damage, or forced entry. More unusually, investigators discovered a thermos of coffee that was still warm enough to suggest its owner had left the vehicle only a short time before deputies arrived. The surrounding silence seemed ordinary for a mountain after dark, yet the complete absence of any nearby person immediately raised concerns that the driver might have suffered a medical emergency somewhere along the ridge. Search teams assembled before midnight and began working outward from the abandoned vehicle. Experienced tracking dogs quickly identified a scent leading away from the parking area toward the remains of the old fire tower. Investigators followed the trail across a narrow footpath covered with fallen leaves before reaching the tower's concrete foundation, where the dogs unexpectedly stopped. Handlers attempted several restarts from different directions, but every effort ended at exactly the same location. Beyond the foundation, neither dogs nor searchers located additional evidence indicating where the missing individual had gone. Fresh rain earlier that afternoon had softened the soil surrounding the summit, yet investigators found only one continuous set of footprints leading from the vehicle to the tower. No return tracks appeared anywhere nearby. At first daylight, the search expanded dramatically. State police helicopters equipped with thermal imaging scanned the surrounding mountains, while volunteer rescue teams divided the forest into carefully measured grid sections. Rangers familiar with the terrain searched abandoned logging trails, rock outcrops, and drainage channels where an injured hiker might have become trapped. Mine safety officials inspected several collapsed entrances located miles away, despite little evidence suggesting the missing person had traveled that far. By the end of the third day, more than 100 volunteers had searched nearly 2,000 acres without locating a single additional clue. The only confirmed evidence remained the station wagon, the footprints ending at the fire tower, and the unanswered question of why no trace continued beyond that point. Investigators soon identified the vehicle's owner as 51-year-old Thomas Granger, an amateur landscape photographer from Elkins who frequently spent weekends documenting remote Appalachian overlooks. Family members described him as meticulous, experienced outdoors, and deeply familiar with the region's mountain roads. Camera equipment recovered from the vehicle contained dozens of photographs taken throughout the afternoon, beginning with rivers, abandoned barns, and autumn forests, before ending with several images of the fire tower shortly before sunset. Nothing in the photographs suggested danger or unusual activity. Analysts carefully reviewed every image, enlarging reflections inside windows, shadows between trees, and distant ridgelines. No unidentified people, vehicles, or wildlife appeared in any frame. Digital evidence offered little additional guidance. Granger's mobile phone last connected to a nearby cellular tower at 8:47 p.m. before losing reception, an expected occurrence given the mountainous terrain. GPS information extracted from his camera confirmed he had remained near the summit throughout the evening. His credit cards showed no activity after purchasing fuel nearly 3 hours earlier, while bank records revealed no unusual financial transactions before his disappearance. Detectives considered the possibility that he had intentionally left the area on foot, but his backpack, flashlight, cold weather jacket, and overnight supplies all remained inside the vehicle. Friends later remarked that Granger never explored unfamiliar trails without carrying at least basic emergency equipment. On the sixth day of the investigation, a forestry employee made a discovery that briefly renewed hope. Less than half a mile from the abandoned fire tower, searchers located Granger's camera lens cap resting beside a moss-covered boulder overlooking a steep valley. The item showed no weather damage despite several days of rain, suggesting it had not been lying there since the initial search began. Detectives immediately returned to the area, expecting to uncover additional evidence. Intensive searches lasting another 48 hours produced nothing else. Forensic testing confirmed the lens cap belonged to Granger's camera, yet investigators could not determine how it reached a location that had already been searched repeatedly by trained personnel. Months later, after active search operations had concluded, detectives completed a final reconstruction of Granger's known movements. Every verified fact supported a simple timeline until the moment he left his vehicle. After that point, the evidence became increasingly difficult to reconcile. The footprints clearly demonstrated he walked toward the abandoned fire tower. The tracking dogs independently confirmed the same route. The photographs established that he had remained calm only minutes earlier. Yet no physical evidence explained how an experienced outdoorsman disappeared from an exposed mountain summit without leaving behind additional tracks, discarded equipment, signs of injury, or indications that another person had been present. The case remains officially open today as an unresolved missing person investigation. Every few years, advances in forensic technology prompt investigators to re-examine the physical evidence preserved from the original search, hoping overlooked details might finally connect the missing pieces of the timeline. So far, none have. Among retired deputies and volunteer rescuers who spent long days combing the forests of Black Ridge, The investigation is remembered not because of what they found, but because of what they never did. In a place where rain preserves footprints, experienced search teams rarely miss obvious evidence, and mountain trails usually tell a clear story. One ordinary autumn evening ended with a trail that simply stopped. For those who worked the case, that unfinished path remains one of the most haunting unsolved stories ever to emerge from the mountains of West Virginia. In this new story, in September of 2022, the West Virginia Association of Chiefs of Police hosted its annual investigative conference in Charleston. Among presentations covering homicide investigations, search and rescue operations, and digital forensics, one session attracted unusual attention despite involving no confirmed crime. The presentation examined a series of unexplained incidents reported over nearly 3 decades by residents of small mountain towns scattered across Appalachia. None of the cases resulted in arrests, none involved identifiable suspects, and none were officially classified as criminal investigations. What connected them was something far more unusual. In every case, experienced investigators concluded that the available evidence supported the witnesses' accounts far more than anyone had initially expected. The first file discussed during the conference originated in Clay County, West Virginia, during November 2016. Shortly after 6 o'clock on a cold Friday evening, the owner of a family-operated hardware store contacted local deputies after discovering the business unlocked despite having personally secured it less than an hour earlier. Nothing appeared to be missing. Cash remained inside the register, expensive power tools were untouched, and surveillance cameras continued recording normally throughout the evening. Deputies initially believed an employee had accidentally returned after closing. Instead, the surveillance footage showed the front door unlocking from the inside without anyone appearing on camera. Investigators reviewed the recording repeatedly, confirming there had been no interruption, digital corruption, or evidence of tampering. The door opened slowly, remained open for approximately 20 seconds, then closed again without a single person entering or leaving the building. Forensic technicians examined the property the following morning, expecting to identify a mechanical malfunction or signs of forced entry overlooked during the initial response. The electronic lock functioned perfectly during testing, fingerprints recovered from both door handles belonged exclusively to employees, and alarm records confirmed the security system had never been deactivated. More surprisingly, investigators determined that the locking mechanism could not physically disengage unless activated either from inside the building or through an authorized access code. The owner confirmed no employee possessed remote access, while security contractors verified that no system errors had been recorded that evening. The investigation concluded without identifying how the door had opened, leaving detectives with evidence that clearly documented the event but failed to explain it. The second investigation came from a small community in eastern Kentucky during August 2018 after volunteer firefighters responded to repeated reports of lights appearing inside a long-abandoned elementary school scheduled for demolition. Residents living nearby insisted the lights appeared only briefly before disappearing again, often after midnight when no authorized workers remained on the property. Responding firefighters entered the building expecting to find trespassers. Instead, they found every classroom empty, windows secured, and electrical service disconnected months earlier. Utility records later confirmed no power had reached the building since the previous winter. Investigators considered portable generators or battery-powered lighting, yet exhaustive searches recovered nothing capable of producing the illumination described by multiple witnesses over several consecutive nights. Unlike rumors that often circulate through small communities, the reports from the abandoned school came from individuals who had little connection to one another. Statements were collected independently from delivery drivers, overnight highway maintenance workers, neighboring homeowners, and a deputy sheriff patrolling the surrounding roads. Each described lights appearing behind second-floor classroom windows before disappearing moments later. Traffic cameras, positioned several blocks away, failed to capture the phenomenon because the building sat beyond their field of view, leaving investigators dependent upon witness testimony supported only by repeated, unsuccessful searches. After nearly 2 weeks, the reports stopped as suddenly as they had begun, and demolition crews removed the structure later that autumn without discovering evidence that anyone had been occupying the building. The final case examined during the conference began in a mountain town along the Virginia border during January 2020. County Emergency Dispatch received several calls reporting that church bells were ringing shortly after 3 o'clock on consecutive winter mornings, despite the church itself having been closed for nearly 6 months while undergoing structural repairs. Maintenance contractors confirmed that the bell tower's electrical controls had been disconnected during renovation work and remained inoperable throughout the project. Deputies responding to the church found locked entrances, undisturbed snow surrounding the building, and no indication that anyone had entered the property overnight. Audio specialists later inspected the bell mechanism, concluding that it could not have operated without electrical power or direct mechanical force. No evidence supporting either explanation was ever found. Investigators reviewing the 3 incidents several years later noted that each initially appeared simple enough to resolve within hours. An unlocked store suggested burglary. Lights inside an abandoned school suggested trespassing. Church bells ringing before dawn suggested vandalism. Yet, every investigation gradually moved away from those ordinary assumptions as physical evidence refused to support them. Surveillance systems functioned correctly, forensic examinations revealed no signs of criminal activity, and independent witness statements remained remarkably consistent throughout each inquiry. Rather than producing dramatic conclusions, investigators repeatedly found themselves eliminating one practical explanation after another until only the documented facts remained. During the conference discussion, veteran detectives emphasized an important distinction often overlooked by the public. None of the official case files described paranormal events, and none encouraged supernatural conclusions. Instead, the reports documented situations in which observable events occurred without leaving sufficient evidence to identify a conventional cause. Experienced investigators considered that distinction essential because unresolved cases demand caution rather than speculation. Even so, many acknowledged that these incidents remained memorable precisely because they resisted ordinary investigative methods despite careful documentation and extensive follow-up. Today, the 3 files remain archived within their respective county agencies, each carrying administrative classifications that simply identify the investigations as closed without resolution. The communities where the incidents occurred have largely returned to ordinary life, with new businesses replacing old storefronts, schools giving way to vacant lots, and church renovations long since completed. Yet among retired deputies, volunteer firefighters, and investigators who personally worked those cases, the stories continue to surface during conversations about the investigations that proved the most difficult to forget. Not because they revealed something supernatural, but because they demonstrated that even in the quietest Appalachian mountain towns, there are still cases where every available fact can be verified, every witness can be believed, and the truth can remain permanently out of reach. In this new story, long before GPS-guided drivers through the Appalachian Mountains, locals in southern West Virginia relied on narrow county roads connecting mining towns hidden between steep ridges. Many of those roads still exist today, winding through dense forests where abandoned coal camps slowly disappear beneath moss and vines. Most are perfectly safe during daylight. Yet, according to sheriff reports, volunteer search records, and decades of local newspaper archives, a handful of isolated locations continue attracting incidents that investigators have never fully explained. They are not officially closed. No warning signs tell visitors to stay away after sunset. Still, many longtime residents quietly agree on one thing: some places in West Virginia should never be visited after dark. In late September of 2019, 41-year-old environmental consultant Rebecca Morgan traveled from Charleston to survey water quality near an abandoned mining watershed outside Fayette County. Her company specialized in restoring streams damaged by decades of coal production, and Rebecca had spent nearly 15 years working in remote sections of Appalachia without a single serious incident. Colleagues described her as careful, experienced, and unwilling to take unnecessary risks. Every survey followed the same routine: arrive before sunrise, complete inspections before evening, and avoid overnight work whenever possible. That schedule changed after unexpected equipment failures delayed the project until late afternoon. Rebecca considered spending the night in a nearby motel, but weather forecasts predicted heavy rain beginning before dawn. Waiting until morning would force another full day of delays and additional travel costs. Shortly after 6:30, she packed her equipment and began driving toward the final monitoring station located near an abandoned mining settlement known decades earlier as Red Hollow. The community had once housed more than 300 families before the last coal operation closed during the mid-1980s. Today, almost nothing remained except broken foundations, scattered utility poles, and a weathered church standing alone beside the road. Before leaving the county maintenance office, Rebecca mentioned her destination to an older road supervisor named Carl Jenkins. Carl had lived in Fayette County his entire life and recognized Red Hollow immediately. Instead of discussing road conditions, he asked Rebecca what time she expected to finish. When she answered that she hoped to leave shortly after sunset, Carl became unusually serious. He quietly suggested postponing the inspection until morning. Rebecca assumed the warning related to rough terrain or wildlife activity. Carl simply shook his head and replied, "The road is fine. It's what people keep reporting after dark that worries me." Before Rebecca could ask another question, another employee interrupted the conversation, and the subject was never mentioned again. The drive toward Red Hollow followed a narrow two-lane road climbing steadily into the surrounding mountains. Cell phone reception disappeared almost immediately after she left the highway. Thick hardwood forests blocked nearly every view beyond the next curve, while abandoned rail lines occasionally appeared beside the pavement before vanishing beneath overgrown vegetation. Rebecca had driven similar roads countless times and noticed nothing unusual during the first hour except how completely empty they seemed. She passed only 3 vehicles, all heading toward town. None traveled in the opposite direction after sunset. At exactly 8:14, according to the timestamp later recovered from her dashboard camera, Rebecca rounded a curve and noticed an old church standing beside the road. Its white paint had almost completely faded away, leaving weathered wooden walls barely visible beneath moonlight. One upstairs window glowed faintly as though someone had left a single lamp burning inside. Rebecca slowed briefly, surprised that anyone still maintained the building after so many years. She continued another mile before reaching the creek crossing marked on her survey map. When she checked the GPS coordinates, they did not match the location recorded by her company. Somehow, she remained nearly 3 miles from the monitoring station despite following the only road available. Assuming she had entered incorrect coordinates, Rebecca turned around. Less than 10 minutes later, she passed the same church again. This time, the front entrance stood partially open. No vehicles occupied the gravel parking lot, no lights shone from nearby homes. The glowing upstairs window remained exactly as before. Rebecca glanced at the dashboard clock and noticed only 4 minutes had passed since she first saw the building. The distance between the church and the creek crossing should have required nearly 10 minutes at her average speed. She stopped briefly on the shoulder, restarted her navigation system, and confirmed the route had not changed. As she continued driving, the road became strangely familiar. Every sharp bend, fallen tree, and damaged guardrail appeared exactly where she remembered seeing them only moments earlier. Then she noticed something even more unsettling. Fresh tire tracks covered the dusty shoulder ahead before ending abruptly beside an abandoned bus stop. There were no tracks leading away. Rebecca stepped out with a flashlight, expecting to find another vehicle hidden among the trees. The forest remained completely silent. Even the usual sounds of insects seemed to disappear. Moments later, her handheld radio emitted several seconds of heavy static before a calm male voice quietly said, "You're going the wrong way." The transmission ended before she could respond. Company records later confirmed nobody else was using that frequency within 50 miles. Rebecca returned to her truck and continued toward the monitoring station without stopping again. Nearly 15 minutes later, she finally reached the location marked on her survey documents. The water sampling equipment remained exactly where technicians had installed it months earlier. She completed the inspection in less than 20 minutes before beginning the return drive. To her surprise, the church had disappeared entirely. The road where it should have stood contained only an empty clearing surrounded by broken stone foundations. State historical records later confirmed a church had once existed there, but burned to the ground during 1993 after being struck by lightning. No rebuilding permits were ever issued. The following week, Rebecca casually described the experience while submitting her field report. Instead of dismissing the story, another environmental consultant admitted witnessing something similar nearly 8 years earlier. Curious, the company's safety manager searched archived incident logs and discovered 3 unrelated employees had reported navigation problems near Red Hollow after sunset over the previous 2 decades. None mentioned ghosts or paranormal activity, all described passing landmarks that later proved no longer existed. The company quietly updated its internal safety guidelines soon afterward. From that point forward, environmental surveys near abandoned mining communities in southern West Virginia would end before sunset whenever possible. The policy cited reduced visibility and remote terrain as the official reasons. Unofficially, several longtime employees believed the change came after too many experienced field workers returned, describing roads that somehow led through places history had already erased. To this day, local deputies continue responding to occasional calls from travelers, reporting strange navigation errors, missing stretches of time, or abandoned buildings appearing where official maps show nothing at all. None of the reports have produced evidence proving anything extraordinary occurred. Investigators continue attributing most incidents to fatigue, unfamiliar roads, or poor nighttime visibility. Yet among the people who have spent their entire lives in the mountains, one piece of advice survives generation after generation. If darkness falls while driving through the forgotten roads of southern West Virginia, and you suddenly recognize a place that should no longer exist, keep driving. Some places in West Virginia should never be visited after dark. In this news story, witnesses still can't explain these ghost encounters. In November of 2012, a remote forestry station near Greenwater, Washington, became the focus of an unresolved investigation. Local authorities received multiple contradictory statements from experienced wilderness professionals who encountered something they simply could not identify on the mountain. Mark Vance was a 34-year-old wildlife biologist who spent weeks tracking nocturnal animal populations across the dense Pacific Northwest Territory. He shared a temporary field cabin with Sarah Jenkins, a 28-year-old forestry technician who mapped severe trail erosion there. According to archive notes, their primary objective was purely scientific and required them to remain outdoors during late-night hours. The environment was notoriously challenging because thick fog frequently rolled through the valley, drastically reducing visibility for anyone in the woods. On the night of November 14, Mark set up motion-activated trail cameras along a deeply isolated ridgeline. Official dispatch logs later confirmed that his radio communication suddenly ceased at exactly 11:45 in the evening that night. Sarah remained at the base cabin, but reportedly noticed an unusual drop in voltage that caused all their electronics to flicker. She attempted to contact him several times, but the radio emitted nothing except a steady, high-pitched static sound instead. State records indicate that weather conditions were completely clear at the base station, which ruled out immediate storm interference entirely. Up on the ridge, Mark reportedly observed a dark silhouette standing completely motionless near one of his newly positioned cameras. He assumed it was a local hiker, so he called out a loud warning about the steep drop-off ahead of them. The figure did not respond to his voice, but it moved backward into the heavy brush with remarkable, silent speed. When Mark walked over to investigate the specific area, he found absolutely no footprints left behind in the damp mud. This detail was particularly baffling because the soil was very soft, meaning any human presence would definitely leave deep impressions. He recovered the camera unit and immediately returned to the base station to review the digital images with Sarah. The county file from 2009 detailed a similar incident where equipment failed, but these current photographs showed something else. The first 3 frames captured a completely blank trail, yet the 4th frame contained a bizarre, distorted visual anomaly. A pale shape was visible beneath the tree line, but its outlines were completely blurred due to unexplained light refraction. Investigators never confirmed if this distortion was caused by a faulty lens mechanism or an actual physical object passing by. Some locals claimed the area was historically prone to unusual magnetic variations that frequently disrupted electronic recording devices there. However, Sarah noticed that the temperature sensors on the camera logged an immediate drop of 20 degrees within 1 minute. The official regional weather data completely contradicted this finding, showing a perfectly stable climate across the entire mountain range. Records conflict regarding whether this brief localized freeze was an environmental anomaly or simply an instrumentation error by the team. The next morning, the 2 researchers decided to examine the ridge together during the clear daylight hours to find answers. They discovered that several heavy branches near the camera site were cleanly snapped off at a height of 8 feet. No heavy machinery operated in that protected zone, and wildlife officials confirmed no large animals matched that specific damage pattern. Furthermore, the broken wood fibers appeared completely dehydrated, which was highly unusual given the constant dampness of the rainforest. A nearby park ranger later filed an auxiliary report stating he heard low-frequency humming throughout the previous night. By the afternoon, the local sheriff department dispatched a single officer to conduct a routine check of the area. The responding deputy noted that both scientists seemed highly credible and showed no signs of panic or mutual deception. He searched the perimeter for evidence of unauthorized trespassers, but his search yielded absolutely no physical evidence of intruders. The official report concluded that an unknown animal or transient hiker likely caused the disturbance on the ridgeline. However, the file remains open today because several technical contradictions in the equipment logs were never fully explained by experts. Independent analysts don't agree on the actual source of the extreme temperature drops recorded by the field equipment. Some experts believe that a localized thermal inversion occurred, while others maintain that the digital sensor simply experienced a malfunction. We can't definitely prove either theory because the original camera unit was later lost during a routine transport to town. The case remains one of the most unusual mysteries in the region, leaving both witnesses without any clear answers. In this new story, on July 26, 2019, emergency responders were dispatched to a narrow stretch of State Route 16 in southern West Virginia after several passing motorists reported finding an abandoned pickup truck resting against a roadside guardrail. The collision itself appeared minor. The airbags had not deployed, the windshield remained intact, and investigators found no evidence suggesting another vehicle had been involved. What immediately concerned deputies was the complete absence of the driver. The truck's engine was still warm when the first deputy arrived, the headlights remained on, and the driver's wallet, cell phone, and vehicle keys were all found inside the cab. Under ordinary circumstances, investigators expected to locate the driver somewhere nearby within a matter of minutes. Instead, the search developed into one of the most unusual missing person investigations the county had handled in years. The truck belonged to 43-year-old Michael Turner, an electrical contractor from Beckley who had spent the afternoon inspecting power equipment at several rural substations following severe summer storms earlier that week. Company records confirmed he completed his final inspection shortly after 8 o'clock before beginning the 70-minute drive home. GPS records taken from his work tablet showed nothing unusual during most of the journey. He stopped briefly at a gas station, purchased coffee, and continued north along the same highway he had driven dozens of times before. Security cameras showed him leaving alone. Nothing in his behavior suggested confusion, distress, or any intention of changing his route. Deputies began searching the immediate area under the assumption that Turner had been injured and wandered into the surrounding woods seeking help. Volunteer firefighters, tracking teams, thermal imaging drones, and canine units spent the remainder of the night examining nearly 3 miles of steep forest surrounding the crash site. Fresh tire marks confirmed the pickup had gradually drifted onto the shoulder before striking the guardrail at relatively low speed. There were no signs of sudden braking, evasive steering, or mechanical failure. More puzzling still, investigators found only a single set of footprints leading away from the driver's door. Those tracks continued for approximately 80 yards before ending abruptly on a patch of exposed rock where tracking dogs lost the scent entirely. During the following morning, accident reconstruction specialists examined the vehicle in greater detail. They found no evidence of intoxication, medical distress, or equipment failure. The truck contained unopened groceries, work documents neatly organized on the passenger seat, and a cooler holding medication Turner was expected to take that evening. His wedding ring remained on the center console after he had apparently removed it while working earlier that day, a habit his wife later confirmed. Everything inside the truck suggested a man expecting to arrive home within the hour. Nothing suggested someone preparing to disappear voluntarily. Investigators next focused on Turner's digital activity. His mobile phone had stopped transmitting only moments before deputies arrived, but technicians recovered location data covering the final 30 minutes of his drive. The information revealed something unexpected. Although the truck had remained on State Route 16, the phone's internal compass repeatedly registered abrupt directional changes inconsistent with the road itself. Analysts initially suspected a software error until identical anomalies appeared in data collected from Turner's dashboard navigation system. Whatever caused the irregular readings affected 2 independent devices operating through different sensors. Engineers were unable to reproduce the malfunction during later testing. As search operations expanded, detectives interviewed motorists who had driven the same stretch of highway that evening. Most remembered nothing unusual beyond the abandoned pickup. One witness, however, provided a timeline that complicated the investigation. Traveling approximately 15 minutes behind Turner, she recalled passing the same white pickup twice within less than 10 minutes, despite remaining on the same road without making any turns. Investigators verified her route using toll records and fuel receipts. According to every available record, she could not have encountered the same vehicle twice unless one of the 2 timelines was incorrect. Yet, surveillance footage from a convenience store confirmed the time she entered the highway matched her statement almost exactly. State police analysts reviewed traffic cameras from neighboring counties, hoping to establish Turner's complete route. Every camera showed the pickup exactly where investigators expected until the final 12-mile section approaching the crash site. No cameras covered that stretch of road directly, leaving investigators to reconstruct events using witness statements, digital records, and estimated travel times. The resulting timeline contained an unexplained gap of nearly 26 minutes. Based on the distance involved, Turner should have reached the crash location long before emergency calls were placed. No evidence explained where he had been during those missing minutes. Search teams remained in the area for 12 consecutive days. Helicopters equipped with infrared cameras surveyed nearby ridgelines, dive teams searched ponds and abandoned quarry pits, Hundreds of volunteers walked carefully spaced grid patterns across dense woodland. Despite covering more than 1,800 acres, investigators recovered nothing beyond the original footprints ending on exposed stone. The absence of additional physical evidence gradually shifted attention away from the surrounding forest and toward the unanswered questions contained within the timeline itself. Several months later, forensic analysts completed a detailed examination of the pickup's onboard computer. Among thousands of ordinary vehicle records, technicians discovered that every electronic system inside the truck had briefly lost synchronized time shortly before the collision. The discrepancy lasted only 43 seconds before correcting automatically. Individually, such errors occasionally occurred in modern vehicles. What attracted investigators' attention was that Turner's phone, work tablet, and dashboard navigation system all recorded nearly the same unexplained interruption within the same minute. Specialists from both the vehicle manufacturer and the software companies involved agreed on only one point. They had never encountered identical timing anomalies across 4 independent electronic systems operating simultaneously. The investigation officially remains open. Michael Turner has never been located, and no evidence has emerged indicating he intentionally disappeared or became the victim of a known crime. His truck still sits inside a secured evidence facility, preserved because investigators believe advances in digital forensics may someday explain details that current technology cannot. The official case file concludes with a straightforward assessment stating that the available evidence is insufficient to determine what occurred during the final half hour of Turner's journey. For the detectives who worked the investigation, however, the unanswered questions begin much earlier than the crash itself. They begin with the missing 26 minutes, a routine drive home, and one of the darkest July nights the county has ever tried to explain. In this new story. Every year, thousands of hikers disappear into the forests of West Virginia, expecting nothing more than steep climbs, unpredictable weather, and long miles of quiet solitude. Most return with photographs, worn-out boots, and stories worth remembering. Search and rescue teams respond to dozens of incidents each season, nearly all involving injuries, wrong turns, or hikers underestimating the terrain. Those investigations usually end with relief rather than mystery. Every so often, however, experienced hikers walk out of the mountains carrying a story they refuse to explain in detail. They are not injured, they are not lost, and they never claim to have witnessed anything supernatural. Yet something happened during those hours in the wilderness that convinced them never to return. One such investigation began during the first week of October 2020. Inside Monongahela National Forest, after a group of 4 experienced hikers abruptly abandoned a weekend expedition they had planned for more than 6 months. The group consisted of 4 longtime friends from Charleston who regularly completed multi-day backpacking trips throughout the Appalachian region. Together, they had more than 30 years of hiking experience and extensive wilderness first aid training. Their route followed an isolated backcountry trail crossing nearly 18 miles of rugged mountain terrain before ending near a designated ranger access road. Weather forecasts predicted clear skies, light winds, and unusually mild autumn temperatures. Rangers later confirmed that trail conditions remained excellent throughout the week, making the trip one of the safest opportunities of the season. Nothing about the group's preparation suggested that the hike would end any differently from dozens they had successfully completed before. According to GPS records recovered later, the hikers reached their planned campsite shortly before sunset on the second day without encountering any unusual conditions. They prepared dinner, filtered water from a nearby stream, and contacted family members using a satellite messenger to confirm everything was proceeding according to schedule. That message became the final routine communication received from the group. Nearly 5 hours later, the same device transmitted an emergency assistance request that did not indicate injury or immediate danger, but urged rangers to reach their location as soon as daylight permitted. No additional explanation accompanied the signal beyond a short message stating that the group was leaving the campsite immediately. Search and rescue personnel located the hikers just after sunrise, walking steadily along the trail toward the nearest access road. Every member of the group appeared physically healthy. Medical evaluations found no dehydration, hypothermia, or signs of exhaustion. Their backpacks remained fully loaded with food, emergency supplies, and camping equipment. Rangers initially believed a family emergency had forced the hikers to end their trip early. Instead, each member insisted they no longer felt safe remaining in the area despite being unable to identify any direct threat. Because the decision seemed unusually abrupt for such experienced outdoorsmen, investigators conducted separate interviews before allowing the group to leave the ranger station. The interviews revealed remarkable consistency. Shortly after 1 o'clock that morning, all 4 hikers awoke independently after noticing that the surrounding forest had become completely silent. None recalled hearing a loud noise or specific disturbance beforehand. Instead, each described waking naturally before realizing something familiar had disappeared. The flowing creek beside the campsite could no longer be heard. Wind moving through nearby trees seemed to have stopped entirely. Even insects, which had remained active throughout the evening, had fallen silent. One hiker later estimated that several minutes passed before anyone inside the camp spoke because each assumed the others remained asleep. The silence itself became the first detail every witness remembered with absolute certainty. Investigators initially suspected changing weather conditions might explain the unusual atmosphere. Meteorological records, however, showed steady wind speeds throughout the night, with no sudden temperature changes capable of altering sound propagation significantly. Rangers familiar with the valley acknowledged that wildlife occasionally became quiet when predators moved through the area, but they emphasized that nearby streams would have remained clearly audible regardless of animal behavior. Audio specialists later examined recordings captured accidentally by one hiker's action camera. The analysis confirmed an extended period during which environmental sounds dropped to unusually low levels compared with recordings made earlier that same evening. Although specialists stopped short of calling the recording abnormal, they admitted the reduction remained difficult to explain using available environmental data alone. Moments after the silence began, one member of the group noticed movement along a distant ridgeline overlooking the campsite. The others later confirmed observing the same motion within seconds. None believed they had seen an animal because the movement remained unusually steady and continued across terrain that should have interrupted visibility several times. Rangers encouraged the hikers to estimate distance, size, and direction during separate interviews. While individual estimates varied slightly, every witness identified the same ridgeline nearly half a mile from camp. None attempted to approach the location. Instead, the group quietly packed essential equipment before deciding to leave as soon as daylight provided safe visibility along the trail. Later that afternoon, rangers returned to the campsite accompanied by wildlife officers and search specialists. The area showed no evidence of recent human activity beyond the hikers themselves. Fresh mud surrounding the tents preserved dozens of boot prints left while breaking camp, but revealed no unidentified footprints entering the site overnight. Wildlife tracks belonging to deer, black bears, and wild turkey appeared throughout the surrounding forest, yet none approached the immediate campsite during the relevant hours. Investigators climbed the ridgeline identified during witness interviews, hoping to locate signs of hikers, hunters, or illegal camps. They found nothing beyond dense forest stretching toward the next mountain valley. As part of the review, investigators examined earlier incident reports involving the same section of trail. Most involved routine rescues caused by injuries or navigational mistakes. 3 files, however, described experienced hikers voluntarily ending trips after reporting unexplained nighttime disturbances that could not be linked to weather, wildlife, or criminal activity. None of those earlier witnesses claimed to have encountered ghosts, unidentified creatures, or dangerous individuals. Instead, each described a growing sense that something in the surrounding environment had changed in a way they could neither identify nor comfortably ignore. Rangers noted the similarity, but cautioned that human perception in isolated wilderness can be influenced by countless natural factors that remain difficult to reconstruct after the fact. The investigation remained open for nearly 4 months, while environmental scientists, wildlife experts, and experienced search coordinators reviewed every available piece of evidence. GPS records confirmed the hikers never left the established trail. Medical examinations ruled out illness or environmental exposure. Satellite communications verified the timeline with remarkable precision. Despite that, investigators could not identify a single event explaining why 4 experienced backpackers unanimously abandoned a carefully planned expedition only hours after confidently reporting that everything was normal. The official report ultimately classified the incident as an unexplained precautionary evacuation with no evidence of criminal activity or continuing danger to the public. Today, the trail remains open and continues attracting thousands of visitors each year without incident. Rangers still recommend the route as one of the most scenic backcountry hikes in West Virginia. The 4 hikers involved have continued exploring wilderness areas across the country, proving that the experience did not end their passion for the outdoors. Yet, according to friends interviewed during the investigation, one subject is consistently avoided whenever old hiking trips are discussed. No member of the group willingly talks about the final night they spent on that mountain. They have never claimed to know what they saw, and investigators have never claimed to know either. All anyone can say with certainty is that 4 experienced hikers entered one of West Virginia's darkest trails, expecting an ordinary weekend in the wilderness. They left convinced that some experiences are better remembered than explained.